a German officer is driving toward the American lines to surrender, and he is not surrendering. It is the early morning of the 4th of May, 1945. In the Austrian Alps, the war in Europe has perhaps 4 days left in it, and a Wehrmacht major is coming down a mountain road under a white flag with a plan that no officer on either side of this war has ever attempted. He is not looking for a prison camp. He is looking for tanks. Behind him, in a medieval castle above the valley, sit a dozen of the most famous prisoners in France, and an SS unit is coming to kill them before the Americans can arrive. He does not have enough men to stop it. So he is driving, at considerable risk of being shot by either side, to ask the enemy he has fought for 5 years to come and fight beside him. Hence, before we go on, if stories like this one matter to you, please take a moment to subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep the memory of these men alive on every side of this war and reach more people who care about them. Thank you. Now, back to that mountain road and to the German officer driving toward the Americans. By May of 1945, the Reich was not so much surrendering as coming apart. Whole German units were laying down their arms, some were still fighting, and in the chaos between those two things there was a third and uglier category. The fanatics, the units that intended to keep killing right up to the last hour, and to settle accounts before the end. That included the prisoners the regime had held for years as bargaining chips. In the mountains of Austria, in a castle that had been turned into a prison for prominent Frenchmen, that reckoning was hours away. And the only people close enough to prevent it were a small band of German soldiers who had decided the war was over, and an American tank crew who did not yet know any of this was happening. The German officer, under the white flag, was Major Josef Gangl. The Ajarakin he was looking for was Captain 10th 23rd Tank Battalion, and what these two men were about to do together on the 5th of May, 1945, at a castle called Itter, would make that day the only occasion in the whole of the Second World War when American and German soldiers fought side by side against a common enemy in the same battle on the same side. Everything here is documented in the American unit records, in the accounts of the French prisoners who watched it happen, in Austrian records of the resistance. The men were real, the battle was real, and it remains one of the strangest and most human things that happened in all 6 years of the war. Schloss Itter is an old stone castle on a rock above a village in the Tyrol, and in 1943, Sattel Prison, an annex of Dachau, for prisoners too valuable to kill and too dangerous to release. The people held there were not ordinary captives. They were the leadership of the France that had fallen in 1940, kept alive as hostages and as symbols, guarded, comfortable by the standards of the camps, and entirely at the mercy of whoever held the keys when the end came. And the list of them is remarkable. 2 former prime ministers of France, Paul Reynaud and Édouard Daladier, the men who had led the country into the war and been blamed for losing it. 2 former commanders-in-chief of the French army, Maxime Weygand and Maurice Gamelin, who despised each other and had to be kept apart. Michel Clemenceau, son of the great French leader of the First World War, Jean Borotra, the famous tennis champion, known across the world as the Bounding Basque, and Marie-Agnès Caillot, the sister of Charles de Gaulle. Together, in that castle, sat much of the living memory of French public life, penned up in the Alps, waiting to find out what the collapse of the Reich would mean for them. In the first days of May, the guards began to melt away. The SS commander of the prison fled. The prisoners, suddenly unguarded, armed themselves with what weapons had been left behind and understood their situation precisely. Somewhere out in the valleys, American forces were coming. Also out there were units of the Waffen-SS, still under orders, still lethal, and entirely capable of arriving first. The prisoners sent a message out with a friendly Czech cook, and later a second one, hoping to reach the Americans in time. And in the town nearby, a Wehrmacht major heard what was happening and made his choice. Life inside Schloss Itter had been its own strange theater for 2 years. The prisoners were not beaten or starved. They were fed, housed in the castle's rooms, allowed books and letters, and guarded by men who understood these were assets, not inmates. What they were not allowed was freedom, or any about what would happen if your regime decided they were no longer useful. So they filled the time by quarreling. Weygand and Gamelin, the 2 former commanders-in-chief, who blamed each other for the catastrophe of 1940, would not speak. Reynaud and Daladier, the 2 former prime ministers, had been political enemies for years and remained so in captivity. They argued about the fall of France in the rooms of an Austrian castle while the war that had begun with their defeat ground on outside. And then, in the first week of May, all of that suddenly stopped mattering because men were coming up the mountain to kill them, and the quarrels of 1940 were not going to help anybody survive the 5th of May. Josef Gangl was a professional soldier, an artillery officer, decorated a veteran of the fighting in Normandy, a man who had served the German army through the whole war. He was also, by May of 1945, a man who had come to a conclusion about the regime he served. And who had already quietly begun working with the Austrian resistance in the closing weeks, trying to protect the local population from the last vicious spasms of the collapsing Reich. He had a small number of soldiers still with him, men who had chosen to stay with him rather than run. And when he learned that the SS intended to reach Castle Itter and settle with the French prisoners, he understood exactly what would happen and exactly how few men he had. It is worth pausing here, because this is a German officer in a story told by Americans, and he deserves to be seen clearly. Gangl was not a man switching sides to save his skin. He was a soldier who had fought hard for his country, and who, at the very end, decided there was something worse than losing, and that a soldier's duty did not extend to standing aside, while a group of unarmed prisoners were murdered by fanatics. He did not have to drive down that mountain. Every reasonable calculation of self-preservation told him to disappear into the hills, wait out the last days, and go home. He drove toward the enemy instead, under a flag of truce, to ask for help he had no right to expect. There are not many finer things any officer did in that war, on any side of it. What Gangl had been doing in those final weeks is worth stating plainly, because it explains the man. In the town of Wörgl below the castle, he had made contact with the Austrian resistance, and had begun using the authority of his own rank to protect civilians from the last convulsions of the regime, working to prevent the reprisals and the destruction that fanatical units were inflicting on their own countrymen, as everything fell apart. He was, in the most literal sense, a German officer using the German army to shield people from the German state. He had a small force still loyal to him, and when the word came about the castle, he did not hesitate over the arithmetic. He had perhaps a dozen or so men. He had perhaps had many times that. The only place left to find help was on the other side of the line. The American he found was Captain Jack Lee, a young tank from Sobota, a cigar-chewing, hard-swearing, entirely unaggressive commander, and an excellent judge of a fight. Lee listened to this German major explain, through an interpreter, that there was a castle full of famous French prisoners up the mountain, that the SS were coming for them, and that he, the German, was asking for American tanks. It would have been entirely reasonable for Lee to disbelieve every word, arrest the man, and go back to his war. Instead, Jack Lee did what the good ones do. He went and looked. He took his tank, a Sherman his crew had named Besotten Jenny, and he drove up the mountain road with Gangl to see the castle for under fire on the way, and satisfied himself that this improbable story was true. Then he went back for help, and got far less of it than he wanted. What he could assemble was almost nothing. A handful of American tankers and infantrymen, perhaps a dozen or so men, and the single Sherman tank. Against them, somewhere below in the valley, were the better part of 100 or more Waffen-SS troops, hardened men with everything to lose, and no intention of surrendering. And so at the castle, the strangest garrison of the entire war assembled itself. American tankers took up firing positions alongside German soldiers, both wearing the uniforms they had been shooting at each other in for years. Gangl's men, Wehrmacht soldiers to the last, but dug in with the GIs. The freed French prisoners, elderly statesmen and generals and a tennis champion, refused to hide in the cellars, as they had been told, and picked up weapons to join the defense of their own prison. Jack Lee, a captain commanding one tank, found himself in charge of Americans, Germans, and a former French prime minister, all preparing to fight the SS together. The night before the attack was spent preparing a defense that nobody had trained for. Lee walked the castle with Gangl, working out fields of fire, placing his handful of Americans and Gangl's Germans where they could cover the approaches and each other, sighting the Sherman at the gatehouse where its gun commanded the road. The French prisoners were told, firmly, to stay in the cellars, and refused, and were eventually handed weapons because there was no time to argue with former prime ministers. Ammunition was counted and found wanting. Telephone lines were used to beg for reinforcements that could not come, and through the small hours, American and German soldiers stood watch together on the walls of an Austrian castle, speaking almost none of each other's language, waiting for the same enemy to come up the same road. The attack began in the early hours of the 5th of May. The SS came up at the castle with machine guns and small arms, and then with an anti-tank gun, and the defenders fought them off that went on for hours. Besotten Jenny, the lone Sherman, sat at the entrance and fired down the approaches to Tantkaun a tank round her to bear from the Atant, and destroyed her. And after that, the defense was rifles and machine guns and whatever the mixed garrison could bring to bear from the old stove. They fought together, and it worked. American and German soldiers shared ammunition and firing positions, and shouted warnings to one another in 2 languages, covering each other's sectors, taking turns at the guns. Jean Borotra, the tennis star. Jean, at 56 years old, volunteered to run the gauntlet, went over the castle wall, sprinted through the SS positions and down the valley to find the Americans and bring relief, and made it. Paul Reynaud, once the Prime Minister of France, stood at a window with a rifle. Whatever these men had been to each other before that morning, they were now simply the defenders of one small castle, and everything depended on holding until help arrived. And in the middle of it, Josef Gangl was killed. He was moving to pull Paul Reynaud out of the line of fire from a sniper who had the window covered, and the shot that would have hit the Frenchman hit the German major instead. He died there, in the courtyard of a castle in his own country, in the last week of the war, alongside American soldiers he had been fighting a week earlier. He was 34 years old, he had a wife and children, and he carried it all. Mountain road, and he carried it all. He had made his choice on that mountain. Nondint, Fulutanzid, Nondinon, Kantrin, and by the middle of the day, the situation inside the castle was close to hopeless. The tank was gone. Ammunition was running low enough that men were counting rounds. The SS had worked around the walls and were firing into the courtyard, and the defenders, Americans and Germans alike, were down to holding the gatehouse and the windows that still had a field of fire. They had been fighting for hours. Nobody in that castle knew whether the messages had reached anyone, or whether relief was on its way, or whether the last hours of the Second World War in Europe were going to end with a massacre in an alpine courtyard. They simply kept firing and reloading and holding the doors, because the alternative was to let the men outside in among the prisoners. The relief came in the afternoon. American armor and infantry, alerted by Borotra's run and by the messages that had gotten out, pushed up the valley and hit the S from behind, and the fight broke apart, and the surviving attackers surrendered or scattered into the mountains. The castle held. Every one of the French prisoners came out of it alive. The prime ministers, the generals, the tennis champion, de Gaulle's sister, all of them, saved on the last afternoon of their captivity by a defense that should never have been possible. 3 days later, the war in Europe was over. The mixed garrison came down off that mountain, and the world went back to its ordinaries were enemies who had just spent 5 years destroying each other's countries. Jack Lee was decorated if he had done and went home and lived a difficult post-war life. The stranger part of this war life, and died relatively young, and never much self, sank quietly into the footnotes. Too odd to fit safe sank quietly into the footnotes. Too odd to fit the shape of how the war was remembered. A battle that did not belong to Hedin version of the French went home to a country that had changed beyond recognition while they sat in the Alps. Reynaud and Daladier returned to French politics. Weygand and Gamelin returned to the long argument over who had lost France in 1940, which followed them the rest of their lives. Jean Borotra, who had run through the SS lines to fetch help at 56, went back to tennis and lived into his 90s. Marie-Agnès Caillot was reunited with her brother, by then the most important man in France. They had spent years as hostages of a regime that could have killed them at any moment, and they walked out alive because of a defense and Germans, mounted by a scratch force of Americans and Dusen, who had been enemies the previous week and who, for one afternoon, were not. Austria remembers Josef Gangl. There is a street named for him in the town below the castle, and he is honored there as a man who died protecting people the regime meant to kill. That is the right way to hold it. He was a German officer who fought for his country in a war his country started and lost, and at the end of it, he made a decision that cost him his life and saved a dozen others, and both of those facts belong to him. There is no need to simplify him into a hero who was secretly on our side all along. He was a soldier who found the line he would not cross, and stood on it, and died there. And that, in the end, is why this small, obscure battle in the Alps has outlived so many larger ones. For a few hours on the 5th of May, 1945, in the last days of the most destructive war in history, a group of men who were supposed to be killing each other looked at what was about to happen to a dozen defenseless people and decided without ceremony that stopping it mattered more than the uniforms they were wearing. Americans and Germans on the same wall, a French prime minister at a window with a rifle, a tennis champion running for help through the enemy, and a Wehrmacht major dying to shield a man he had every political reason to hate. The war had spent 6 years teaching everyone that the uniform was the whole of a man. On one afternoon in a castle in Austria, a handful of soldiers proved it never had been, and some of them paid for the proof, and it is worth remembering all of them.